And with the Row House Forum, I always try to pick topics that I like to say humans would be interested in. So you don't have to be a person of any particular philosophical bent or background or faith. But I want to do events that people would care about, and that person has something to say about them, or they're working in that area in a faithful way. And so Jen definitely fits the bill, and she's doing something we all care about. And you're here tonight, or if you're watching, we all sleep, and we all have questions about it, and we'll probably learn some things tonight we didn't know. And then some of us really struggle, I don't personally, but struggle with getting enough sleep, and that can be a real trauma. So we trust that she'll address that as well. So if you're interested in this topic, you must be human. So we're going to gain something, and hope we all gain something from her talk tonight. I think her credentials will speak really loudly in terms of her ability to speak to this topic. She does run a sleep clinic, and she is director of that clinic at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, where she's also assistant professor in the biology department. She has degrees from Stony Brook U and NYU. So she's credentialed and knows her stuff and is continuing to practice in this area. Her lab is focused on understanding the impact of sleep and disease on memory formation. So anyway, I think, but beyond that, her character speaks even loudly. I just really appreciate her enthusiasm and energy and graciousness in coming tonight. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. So let's hear it for Jen. Let's give her a good Lancaster welcome. Jen Tudor.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Tom, for that lovely introduction. It is great to be with you. It's very exciting to talk about a topic that, if I was being very honest, I did not find interesting when I was first assigned to study it almost 20 years ago. But I'll tell you a little bit about the history of how I got to this topic and share with you what we do. So just to kind of start off in terms of connecting, my lab at the university at St. Joe's specifically is looking at a very, very small facet of sleep. And I've always been interested in how memories are formed because I think it's such an important aspect of who we are is based in our memories. And so I wanted to know how are memories formed, and through a series of, some people will call them coincidences, people of faith might call it providence, but whichever way is your bent, I came to this topic of sleep, and my professor was like, oh, you should study sleep with this graduate student, and I was a young 18-year-old student, and I said, no, sleep is boring. By design, sleep is very boring. I was like, no, thank you. And she's like, no, it's more exciting than what you think, and you should definitely join it. And I was like, no, I want to do something like Alzheimer's disease or something more exciting. And so it started there, and it really has come full circle where now the majority of the work that we do in the lab is focused on sleep research. So this is just a picture of the lab. This on the left is pre-COVID times when we were actually able to be together, and then on the right you can see us where it's post-COVID times or during COVID times, and we spend a lot of time on Zoom together. But I have some excellent undergraduates. They do amazing work with me, and so I'll be highlighting some of that work today. But what I figured I'll start with is I'll give you a little primer, and this is my sleep lecture I give to my undergraduates often, just to give us all a baseline as to what sleep is and how we define it in the scientific community. And then from there, we can then talk about my particular interest area as to how, when we don't sleep, what it's actually doing in our brains, give you a little primer for that. And then we'll spend most of our time in Q&A, and hopefully any questions you have. If I don't have the answer for it, I will find you the answer to it. Or we don't know the answer to it, to be perfectly honest. So let's start there. Okay, so by the way, so I am not a sleep doctor. So I want to clarify, I don't actually study humans with sleep. That's why my title slide has mice on it, because I actually study mice, because I don't think any of you would want me to take out a piece of your brain after you're sleep deprived to analyze it. But I can do that with my mice, and so actually I do sleep preclinical research, essentially. But in the sleep clinics, there is something called the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. And in the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, It's a very quick way, and it's one of many, many metrics that sleep scientists have, but it's one metric to determine how sleepy are you. So the way this scale works is you would assign a number from 0 to 3, 0 being never chance to doze in that scenario, versus 3, a very high chance of dozing. So for example, it is almost like a signal to me that if I am sitting in front of a television, it is sleepy time. And so sitting in front of a TV, it would be 3 for me. But if it's just a slight chance, it would be a 1, if a moderate chance, 2, and very high chance is 3. So answer these list of questions to the very best of your ability. And by the way, this is without alcohol, so don't think about it as like, oh, with alcohol, I'll certainly be sleeping. So these are all scenarios without necessarily alcohol. So take a moment. So the first one is sitting and reading, watching TV, sitting in a public place, being a passenger in the car. That's also pretty much a high signal for me to fall asleep. Lying down to rest, sitting and talking to someone. Believe it or not, people do fall asleep with that. Sitting quietly after lunch without alcohol, and in a car while stopped for a few minutes in traffic. So take a gander and try to come up with your number.
Do you quantify it by time of day? Like if it's an evening?
Any time of day, I would say. Any time of day, just kind of average, yeah. All right, so add up the numbers as you have them. And let's see where we fall. All right, so anybody around 4 or under? 4 or under, that's very good. That means you are very well rested. 4 or under, okay. 7 or under? 7, okay. Anybody over 10 willing to share? 10? Okay, we got a few. All right, so, and these numbers vary depending on country. So I will tell you that, for example, Australia, the average sits right around 3 to 4, depending on the day, mood, and when we give this. About 10 to 20% of the population is actually over 10. And so if you have a number of 10 or over, it's considered pretty highly sleepy, and most likely, sleep deprived, and we would do other metrics for that. But it's like a quick gander to see how sleep deprived are you. And so the reason this is such an important idea is because there's a lot of things that happen that can be attributed to issues with sleep deprivation or shift work that can be associated with problems with sleep. So, some of the major disasters of the 20th century can be attributed to that, but 100,000 car crashes a year can be attributed to some form of sleep deprivation and things of that nature. So it is not a minor issue, problems with sleep, and it has become all the more of a concern given that in our modern society, and especially in the pandemic era, it's very easy to be working 24 hours a day without a set schedule. We're constantly on our phones, we're constantly communicating. So it has become more of a modern issue than maybe 100 years ago. So I've been using the word sleep. Let us try to define it. Does anybody want to try to define sleep with me?
Restorative state?
A restorative state, okay, that might be one thing. If an alien were to come down on Earth and be like, what is this thing called sleep? How would you describe it? How would we define it? Anybody? Unconscious? Okay, how would death be different than sleep related to unconscious? The breathing, okay? How is coma different than from sleep? I don't mean to put you on the spot. It's just,
It's deeper?
You wake up, and that is actually a real key feature of sleep. It's a reversible process. You wake up from it. You're able to come out of that unconscious state. So yes, this is how scientists have defined it. So we know that it is universal among higher vertebrates. Many, many animals sleep, as if you have pets, you probably have seen them sleep. We spend about a third of our lives we spend sleeping. So clearly there must be an important reason for sleep. And so this is how it has been historically defined. It's a readily reversible state, which is pretty key because otherwise it could be considered coma or death, and reduced responsiveness to the environment. And typically those that are sleeping have three major characteristics. One is sustained immobility, so staying still. There's usually a typical posture related to sleep. So although I've had a bearded dragon and it has all sorts of crazy postures when it's sleeping, but there's typically a characteristic posture associated with it and reduced responsivity to the environment. So that's how we have defined sleep in science. And actually there are many, many organisms that actually sleep. And so sleep has been defined even down to little nematodes, worms, invisible or not visible really with the naked eye worms, obviously all sorts of marine mammals and marine animals and birds, and it's been kind of seen in a lot of different organisms. Recently, about 4 years ago, a paper came out that showed that jellyfish sleep, and so we are, learning and to this day very much finding all sorts of organisms sleeping, and we know flies sleep and et cetera, et cetera. So not just vertebrates, but invertebrates now have been defined to be sleepers as well. So how is this process of going to sleep and waking up from sleep, how has that been described? What are the things and factors that really drive sleep? There are two major mechanisms for sleep. And you're pretty familiar, I think, with both of them. So there is, I'm sure you've heard of the 24-hour circadian cycle. Everybody has a 24-hour clock that their body is attuned to, and it's actually light that resets our circadian cycle. This is actually very important for sleep hygiene. Sleep hygiene is this word we use in terms of how well we sleep or how not well we set up the environment to sleep, but we'll talk more about that in Q&A, I'm sure. So there's a circadian cycle, so that's process C, and that's the line that's going up and down that kind of just looks like regular, rounded waves. Process S is literally the process of sleep, and so the longer you are awake, the more you want to go to sleep, right? So there is this built-up drive to go to sleep as you are awake. And then when you fall asleep, that drive decreases, and then you wake up, and then that drive slowly builds up again. So that is that top line, the process S line. So there's a process S and a process sleep that's been described by psychologists many, many years ago. And so it is the working of these two processes, the time spent awake, kind of driving your desire to sleep, as well as the 24-hour clock. And those two processes, when they are aligned, ideally that's when sleep occurs. That being said, if you've pulled an all-nighter, it's very easy to fall asleep during the day because your process S is overwhelming this 24-hour clock. But it is that balance between process S and process C that's really regulating whether one sleeps or not. And so I get asked the question, how do I know if I'm sleeping well? What characterizes good sleep from bad sleep? And so before I actually get into answering that question, I need to tell you a little bit about sleep. So sleep functions as 90-minute cycles, okay? And so it's a 90-minute cycle, and actually that's why there are some calculators online that says, oh, if you go to bed at this time, these are the ideal times to wake up, and you'll notice that there are actually 90-minute cycles in terms of what are ideal times to wake up. And the reason for that is because essentially within these 90-minute cycles, and so typically a person who sleeps at night averages somewhere between 4 to 8 cycles, within that 90-minute ideal. And so, with that 90-minute cycle, you go through different stages of sleep. So I'm sure many of you heard of REM sleep, where the rapid eye movement sleep. It is not REM sleep. REM is the name of a band. It is not a sleep stage. REM is the sleep stage. My sleep professor from Brown University told me that years ago, and I've never forgotten it. So I share that little nugget with you all. And in REM sleep, That is also known as paradoxical sleep, and you can see the REM sleep is in that blue line at the top of our chart there. And you'll notice there's more bouts or more time spent in REM sleep later on in the night, a la earlier in the morning. Okay, so you actually see someone going through REM more so in the early morning hours as opposed to the early night hours. Then there are the non-REM stages, and there are 4 of them. So there's stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, and essentially it goes in terms of depth of sleep. So if someone's in stage 3 or 4, it's typically very, very difficult to wake them up. You can make a loud noise in the room, and it'll be very hard to wake them up. So that's like a very deep stage of sleep. It's considered the restorative stage of sleep, and that most people, when they're in stage 3 or 4, is very difficult to wake up. And if they are awoken during stage 3 or 4, typically they're very sleepy and they'll fall back asleep very quickly, or they're just kind of groggy for a very long time. We call that sleep inertia, that there's consistent inertia when they're woken up in stage 3 or 4. So ideally, if you're being woken up by your alarm, you're being woken up in stages 1 or 2, the lighter non-REM stages of sleep. Stage 1 is interesting. Stage 1 is what I did a lot in maybe church or college when I was younger, and I would have my eyes closed and I'm like, oh, I'm hearing every word, and I think that I'm awake, but in reality I was actually sleeping. That's stage 1. If you awake someone who was in stage 1 sleep, they would often say, oh, I was just closing my eyes, and I'm sure you might have heard that. So that's stage 1. So that's stage 1 sleep. Stage 2 sleep is where we spend most of our time in sleep, and that's actually the transition period of sleep. So it is not, most people don't sleep in this like clear-cut, charted out way. Typically, they kind of go into stage 2, they'll go down into 3, come back to 2, go up to 1, come back to 2. 2 is that nice transition stage of sleep. And often, what's really cool about stage 2, what I think is really cool, is if you have a person's brain hooked up to an EEG to read their brain waves while they're in sleeping. And if they are in stage 2 sleep, if you say their name, or if there's a loud noise in the room, you could actually see the brain respond to it. Okay, so there is actually still some sensory information coming in from the outside. It is reduced responsiveness. You're not necessarily going to wake the person up, but their brain has processed that information. It clearly responded to that information, which I think is really neat. So whereas stage 3 and 4, you don't see that nearly as readily. So the stage 2 is our transition stage, and we spend most of our time into, and we kind of float up into stage 1 or even REM, and then float down into 3 or 4. So we spend the majority of our time in the early parts of the night in this deeper stage 3 and 4, and the early parts of the morning or later on in the night, the longer you are sleeping, you'll spend time in REM sleep. And so that says something about perhaps what is the role of sleep, but that is a big conversation in the sleep research field, and I'm happy to have that conversation with you during Q&A. Just some thoughts about sleep across different developmental periods from babies on to adults and then wiser adults would be that, typically children need more sleep. Okay, so young children need lots of sleep compared to less young children, I guess. Once they hit young adult or adult stage, they have a fairly typical sleep pattern, hopefully. And a misnomer or misunderstood concept is that the elderly don't require as much sleep. That is actually not true. The elderly do require about the same amount of sleep as they did when they were younger adults. However, it is very often that aged sleep is a little more fragmented. So you can see they spend a lot less time in like long periods of deep sleep, and they toggle up and back and down from the deep sleep to the lighter sleep much more so. Like my grandmother, for example, she could not sleep more than 3 hours, in one bout. And so she basically were like 3 hours awake and 2 hours, sleeping, and then 2 more hours awake and then 2 more hours sleeping. It was just kind of cycling through. And so that is typical, these problems of maintaining deep sleep or long bouts of sleep. And there is some suggestion that evolutionarily that is not that we weren't made to sleep one night during the night, and it's actually a really a robust conversation in the sleep research field. And it's also a robust conversation in those of people of faith in terms of the context of that and sleep. So happy to have that conversation after our talk. I did want to take a second before I finish my general lecture on sleep to discuss the different chemicals that affect sleepiness. So there's been a search since the 1950s for the chemical in our body that signals the need to sleep. And so there is an idea that there is some kind of chemical or hormone or protein that builds up in our brains or in our bodies that signals the need for sleep. And so there's been a lot of proposed different chemicals and hormones out there. So serotonin, you may have heard of, is one, this mood-altering hormone. It is actually the precursor to melatonin, which I'm sure you have heard of, related to sleep. And melatonin actually does increase in our body naturally, as like right around now, actually, in the 7 to 9 p.m. is when melatonin increases, and ideally you fall asleep when you are at that kind of max level of melatonin. And so there's a lot of people that artificially take melatonin to fall asleep easier. I do not think that it's the best idea to rely on melatonin, because if you are artificially giving your body melatonin, then it's going to stop producing it naturally, and so that could be a potential problem. So melatonin's another thing. Caffeine, we all are very familiar with the role of caffeine in keeping us awake, and the reason for that is because it's actually related to adenosine, which is, it's another chemical that builds up, that we found that builds up, is actually one of our best thought of chemicals that actually builds up in our bodies and is most associated with the initiation of sleep. And so what caffeine does, caffeine prevents the action of adenosine in our brain, and so it prevents us from feeling sleepy along those lines. So that's why caffeine and coffee works to keep us awake. And I'm happy to discuss that as well, but that is really like us drugging ourselves to make sure that we can be awake, and ideally we don't want to do that. We want to sleep, we don't want to not sleep. And I think there is an idea that I've been working on in relation to the Q Commons talk that Tom brought up, which is that we're so busy, and I have this idea because I am very guilty of it, so I'm going to just be very honest with you. I fight going to bed because I think I could be more fruitful or more productive or do greater things. And it's only in recent years, and my husband actually has taught me this a little bit, that it's better to go to sleep so that I can be more productive when I am actually awake. Do as I say, not as I do, maybe, as we go to that. So sleep deprivation really is a national health epidemic that we are like artificially, chemically trying to avoid, and it's not really working. These statistics are a bit outdated, but it is true. Millions of workers are sleep deprived. About, like I said, 10 to 20% of our population is probably severely sleep deprived. There are some people out there that say, oh, I have that special gene that allows me to only sleep a few hours. And there is a gene that leads to short sleepers, but it is very, very, very rare in the population. You most likely don't have it, so don't assume that. Go see a sleep doctor, please, if that is your problem. But all of these workers being sleep deprived is costing companies billions of dollars a year. Also, it leads to increased risk of obesity, heart disease, cancer, and my special area of expertise, which is memory impairment. So I think of myself as a memory researcher, and I just happen to use sleep as a model to understand that. So the area of the brain that I'm most interested in is this area called the hippocampus. So you can see it here in bright green on the left. That's from a mouse brain. You'll notice it's fairly large in comparison to the entire size of the brain of that mouse. Whereas the shaded region kind of circled in red, that is the hippocampus in a human. It kind of comes out this way and it's more medial in the middle of our head. And the hippocampus is an important area for memory storage. It's where our memory of facts and figures come from. Our memories are really stored there of different episodes in our life, as well as spatial memory. So like as you are driving, it's like, oh, you got to make the left at the McDonald's and then take the right at the park. That kind of spatial orientation, that kind of information is also stored in the hippocampus. So I'm particularly interested in the hippocampus. And so I figured I'll spend the last few minutes just kind of sharing with you some of the data that my students and I have kind of come up together, just to show you some of the research that we're doing. So not only are you going to get a little talk about sleep today, you're going to learn a little about memory today and how memories are formed. So I fall in the category of there's 3 major stages of memory formation, and this might sound intuitive. Like a lot of sleep research and memory research is pretty intuitive, but there's the idea of, okay, you are acquiring information. So hopefully you are awake right now listening to me talk, and you are acquiring some information, and that is coming into your head, and we call that the encoding stage. So the memory begins. And when the memory comes in, it is in a very loose labile state. It is not like making a memory on a computer chip and it just stays there forever. Obviously, you know that probably from your experience. So it's in a very loose state, and there's a period called memory consolidation where genes are expressed, proteins are made, connections are formed in the brain, and that memory can become into a more permanent state. So we call that memory consolidation. We know that during this memory consolidation phase, if you sleep during that phase, it actually helps make the memory. You don't have to sleep to make the memory, because clearly you can consolidate memory as you are awake. But if you do sleep, it does help with these processes to express certain genes and have certain signaling cascades happen to permanently kind of, or make the memory more stable. And then there's this third stage called retrieval, where when you think back on that memory is retrieved and accessed. When memory is accessed, it becomes labile and unstable again. And so it has to undergo consolidation and be reformed and re-solidified. The process of retrieving a memory actually loosens up that memory. This is why memory is so sensitive to interference. It is so sensitive to it being changed. It's so sensitive to being wrong. And that's why first-person accounts and narratives tend to be wrong, because every time you retell the story, you can change it just enough and then make that memory to think that it's the real memory. But you can switch it and make it really labile. So I am most interested in this consolidation phase of memory formation and what is happening in the brain, specifically with the different cells in the brain, to make the memories form, to make it more permanent. So that's the research that my lab is working on. So we did a fairly straightforward experiment. And a lot of these experiments, I'm going to kind of show you the most straightforward version of it. But we took a mouse, and mice are nocturnal, in case you didn't know. But if you've had mice living in your walls, like I have, you hear them at night. And so with the nocturnal activity of our mice, the lab mice, what we do is when the lights go on, we see them actually snuggling up to get ready to go to bed. Yeah, they really do. Yeah, it is cute. I mean, like, they make their little nest and make it nice and round and comfy for them. And then in our experiments, what we do is we watch them, and when it looks like they're about to fall asleep, we shake their cage and they wake up again. And so they get very uncomfortable for the 5 hours, but we treat our mice actually pretty well. So we did 5 hours of sleep deprivation. So this is a single bout, a single day, a single moment where they have 5 hours straight where they cannot sleep. And we asked, well, what happens in their brain? So the questions we were asking is, does sleep deprivation affect the process to make proteins necessary to kind of form and solidify the memory? And specifically in the hippocampus brain region. And then what are the different signaling cascades that are involved with sleep deprivation? And then can we prevent this problem with sleep deprivation from happening? What can we do to prevent it or blunt the impact of sleep deprivation? So those were the questions that we asked. And so this is Emily. Emily is actually, she's got her PhD now, but she was an undergraduate with me at the University of Pennsylvania. Not with me, well, I was a postdoc, she was an undergraduate. We worked together to do this experiment. And so we asked, can we measure every new protein that's being made in the brain, specifically in the hippocampus, during that 5 hours of sleep deprivation? Can we measure that? Is there a way that we could identify these proteins? So we did a pretty cool experiment where we injected this antibiotic called pyrimycin. And what pyrimycin does is that when it comes in, it actually it gets added and incorporated into every newly made protein during our 5 hours of sleep or 5 hours of sleep deprivation. So if there's more of this pyrimycin that's been added into new proteins, then we would have more protein synthesis. And if there's less, then there'll be less protein synthesis. So then we compared it with our sleep-deprived and non-sleep deprived mice during the 5 hours sleep deprivation from 7 a.m. till about noon. And what we found is that when we measured the amount of proteins, if you look on the left there with the NSD, that's our non-sleep deprived, it's much darker, and all the bands are much darker. So proteins that are very large and even proteins that are very small are much darker than the sleep deprived, which you see right next to it, which is a lot lighter. And when we did the comparison, you can see it's about a 40 to 50% decrease, which was significant in our sleep-deprived mice and non-sleep deprived. So this is the first time that anyone really showed, and Emily and I worked on this, that when one is not sleep deprived, or when one is deprived of sleep, their brain is making much less protein that is required to make a memory. And so that suggests that that's one of the reasons why there are memory impairments, because the brain is just not making the proteins needed to solidify the memory during memory consolidation. And so yes, we found that sleep deprivation impairs this protein synthesis. And we did a whole bunch of other experiments, and we kind of pinpointed a particular signaling pathway that is very important for this. And this is a subset of the insulin signaling pathway, so it is actually related to the role of insulin in the brain and energy, and how the brain uses energy. So that's part of a much bigger story, but suffice to say, we kind of picked out this signaling pathway and realized that that is what is causing these deficits in the process of making proteins. And we're like, okay, so now that we know this signaling pathway, can we manipulate it and prevent the memory deficits, even though sleep deprivation is actually happening? So that was can we cure sleep deprivation? That's what our quest was. So Caroline Chung, who is probably finishing up medical school now at the University of Pennsylvania, worked on this, and that's Bella Succi and Natalie Burkert. They're students of mine that are either just recently graduated or will be graduating this spring that's worked on this project. And so what we did is we made some viruses. Frankly, it's actually a similar technology to the J&J vaccine. We're using these viruses to kind of express proteins. And so we made a virus to express this 4-ABP2 protein that we found was very important in the brain. And we expressed it specifically in a particular type of neuron in the hippocampus, which we thought was the important brain cells to make the memory. And so what we found is that when we did that, protein synthesis goes up. So you'll notice that the bright two bars are in green, that they're much darker when they were given this virus. And that means that there was more proteins being made with this virus, regardless of whether the mice were sleep deprived or if they were sleeping. So did this do anything to their memory? So I will take a second to just kind of highlight this. So you can't ask a mouse, oh, mouse, please remember this series of numbers and then tell it back to me. Like, that's not the kind of memory we can test with mice. So how do we do that? How do we test memory in mice? So we put them in this box, and they have exposure to 3 different objects, and the mouse will they're interested in novel things. So they're going to go around, sniff the different objects, and like figure out what's going on. And what you'll find is with each training period, and they go through 3 of them, they spend less time checking out the objects because they're like, oh yes, I already know this bottle is here, this tower is here, and all that stuff. So they look at the different objects. We have 3 of them in the box. So if they're spending any time more than 1/3 of their time looking at the different objects, right? Basically 33% of the time they're looking at each object. That's the idea, if everything was working at chance. So you'll notice that on our left, in the light gray, we had 3 mice that performed this where 24 hours after training, when we moved one of the objects, that motion or that different location of that same object, but because it's in a different place in the box, they actually spend more time on it. And so they're like, oh, this is novel, this is weird, the mouse is in the, this thing is in the wrong place, so they'll spend more time on it than the 33% chance. So they have this memory intact in the non-sleep deprived mice. But notice in the darker gray, 4 of the mice spent actually below chance, which I'm not sure how it's possible, but they were really bad at this, and they were sleep deprived, and they had memory impairments, and they didn't spend time on that moved object. So that's our control. And so when we use this virus to express this gene, look what happened. The non-sleep deprived mice had memory. They still remembered, but now our sleep deprived mice, their performance went way up. And so basically, they were sleep deprived, but they had memory intact. So I cured sleep deprivation. Sort of, not really. And the reason I say sort of not really is because 4-EBP2 is part of that insulin signaling pathway. You know where it's been most studied? It's actually a cancer-causing pathway. So if you think about what cancers and tumors are, it's basically unmitigated, unregulated protein production. And that's why you have tumor growth, right? So about 75, depending on who you talk to, 75 to 90% of all cancers are due to problems in this particular signaling pathway. So while I might have prevented memory deficits in my mice, if I let them go live much, much, much longer, they might be developing all sorts of things in their brain that's not pleasant. So that's why we need to actually get more information as to what proteins are really important to be made. But now I know that making proteins is very important for the process of sleep and memory formation during sleep. So that's kind of where we're at. So just as a summary, we figured out that sleep deprivation does impact the making of proteins. We know the signaling pathway that's important for this making of proteins. And we are able to actually, if we increase and boost up the protein production, we can actually prevent memory deficits associated with sleep deprivation. And for context, this is just 1 night. So think about this as the equivalent of if you decide to stay up till like 1 or 2 a.m. and then have to wake up at 6 a.m., which I'm sure many of us have done for all sorts of various reasons related to family or personal. So it is a big thing. We have some data to show that it's actually very reversible system, so that if you get a couple hours of sleep, not even 5 hours you lost, but just a couple hours on top of the 5 hours you lost, everything will go back to normal. So we have some data to show that it is very reversible. All right, so let me acknowledge just my amazing students. I have a pretty big lab at St. Joe's that have really worked hard on these projects, some of whom you saw pictures of. I have collaborators from the University of Pennsylvania, Iowa, and Florida State University that have helped with this project. We actually do, like I said in that umbrella picture, we have projects on Alzheimer's disease, on autism, and we have a lot of different projects going on. And I'm happy to talk about all those as well. But obviously, I happen to think that this is just kind of really amazing science that my undergraduate students are doing, and some of my master's students are doing well. So that will conclude my talk and a brief primer on sleep and sleep deprivation. And I'm happy to take some questions now. So I think Tom is going to help me with the navigating of the question process.
Yeah,
So, all
yeah.
right.
I want to, especially if you're watching online, I haven't seen any questions yet from you people who are watching, so don't be bashful. Send some questions over. There's no such thing as a really dumb question. Maybe just slightly dumb, but not really dumb. No, that's not true. Also, you guys in the room here too, you know the rules. Just keep it to a question. No comments, please, unless, you want to make a comment later to her, that's fine, but let's keep it to a question so she can answer them. Keep it brief, and we'll just keep it going here as long as we can. But we should probably thank her for a great talk. Great. All right. All right, so yeah, I wanted to ask about sleep deprivation, memory formation. Is there any research now on screen use related to sleep deprivation?
Yeah, so there's a lot of data out there about the increase of a particular wavelength that we call the blue light, right? And that blue light is actually pretty effective in affecting our process C, that circadian cycle. And so the more exposure to blue light that we have later on in the evening, it's actually preventing us from falling asleep. And so light, like I said, light exposure is actually very, very important in terms of maintaining our circadian rhythms and maintaining a good rhythm in terms of waking up and falling asleep. So there's a lot of blue light filters. You've probably noticed on your phones that you have the option of going yellow, right, at night. And a lot of that has been really advocated by the scientists that are looking at circadian rhythms. So as in terms of blue light and memory formation, I have less information about, but certainly blue light and circadian rhythms, it's a thing. So, the idea of sleep hygiene. So if you have problems sleeping, one of the suggestions that sleep scientists and sleep doctors have is reduce the blue light that you are exposed to at the end of the day. Probably the worst thing is like staring at your phone when you have insomnia, because that's just furthering the issue. I don't suffer from insomnia. I sleep pretty well, so that's not my issue. It's just I fight going to sleep. That's different. But yeah. So that's the blue light thoughts currently.
Yeah. Anybody here in the room have a question?
So you mentioned autism. Are they linked? And kind of along those lines, mental health issues like bipolar, a lot of times at the height of that, they can't fall asleep.
Yeah.
So are those two questions?
Yeah. So the question of whether there is a link related to sleep problems and autism, is that correct? Yeah. So there is some data certainly out there because having great sleep hygiene, creating the most optimal environment to fall asleep requires a lot of different things. And one of them happens to be sensory input, right? So how much touch, how much light, so one example is don't take a shower before going to bed, because all of that water stimulating and hitting you is only going to wake you up. It's not great sleep hygiene. It's actually going to keep you awake, as opposed to taking a bath, which should be soothing, relaxing, and doesn't require as much stimulatory, And so some of the sleep problems associated with autism, from what I understand, is that because of the sensory problems that are often associated with autism, that leads to potential issues with sleep. And so like weighted blankets have been shown to be very helpful because of this, as somebody described to me, it feels like a giant hug. And I don't like that feeling myself.
Giant hug.
A giant hug. I don't like weighted blankets, but other people love the weighted blanket because of the environment it actually creates. So, and in terms of mental illnesses or psychiatric illnesses, I am less familiar with that as it relates to sleep. I know that there are some documentation as to it, but actually the one area that I'm more familiar with, because I was doing Alzheimer's disease and neurodegenerative research when I was in graduate school, is that there's this big phenomena of sundowning. So in the evening hours, those with Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative disorders, they have real emotional outbursts as well as problems of going to sleep because of that. And so there's a lot of research in terms of the interplay between neurodegenerative, specifically Alzheimer's disease, and sleep problems. It's actually a real area of research, because is it the sleep problems that are exacerbating the Alzheimer's, or is it the Alzheimer's that's causing the sleep problems, and then vice versa, and then which one's chicken egg, and it's a real active research area right now.
So it's called like a sundowner's effect?
There is, yeah, so it's called sundowning, sundowning, and there's emotional outbursts often that occurs, and it happens right around the 5 to 6 p.m. time frame, from what I understand. So it's a really big area of research right now. There's a lot of push, actually, to the Alzheimer's field to be like, figure this out, because there is clearly a memory with Alzheimer's link. And there's clearly a sleep and Alzheimer's link. And the question is, how do we do that with the memory, sleep, and Alzheimer's? So it's a big area of research. And actually, we're also working on that as well. So,
Thanks.
sure.
Yeah, somebody else here? Yeah.
Why do we sleep at night when it's dark? I mean, what does the dark and the light have to do with our sleep? And then what about practically those that work third shift? And have a reverse cycle, and how does that affect brain memory?
Yeah, so in the science world, we think that sleeping at night for us just made sense because we couldn't really do much else before we had electricity, right? So like it was really driven by like, well, we can do stuff, hunt, gather, plant, whatever, build furniture, whatever it was, build tools. We were able to do that when the sun is out. We can't do that nearly as much when the sun goes down. Although people in the evolutionary biology and sleep field have been proposing that there's actually 2 sleep bouts at night, and there's actually a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, and so that's more natural evolutionarily, and they were looking at some Aboriginal tribes and looking at some of the data with that. Why is light so important? So aside from that kind of like practical explanation of it, the biological explanation is actually that with light, we have something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. It is cells that kind of sits right behind our eyes. It's a part of a region of our hypothalamus, which is really important for regulating basically our hormones as it relates to our body function. And so that every time light is shining through your eyes, it's actually activating and hitting upon the suprachiasmatic nucleus or affecting the suprachiasmatic nucleus. That affects our 24-hour cycle. So there are those of us, I think I'm naturally one of these, actually I know I'm naturally one of these, where I'm a night owl, and if I was left to my own devices, my day would get naturally longer and longer and longer, and this has actually happened to me, where I would fall asleep later and later, wake up later and later, and so my day is not really 24 hours if left to my own devices without any light input. My day is probably closer to like 24.3 or 24.4 hours. So one summer when I was doing sleep research, I actually completely flipped, and I was working in the middle of the night, and I was working that third shift. And it's kind of an insidious process, because the more I was working at night, the more I was sleeping during the day, the less light I was getting during the day, the less I was able to like get back onto a normal day-night schedule. So light has a very important role in putting us in this 24-hour cycle. And so one of the advice I give to my students all the time is get as much morning light as possible so that you are on a 24-hour cycle, as opposed to, college students run vampire hours often. And so it's like, no, that's not ideal, because you're not getting the morning light. And actually there's a lot of data to show that it is associated with mental or declining mental health, not getting that morning light and things of that nature. So seasonal affect disorder, and those that live in the polar regions and stuff, there's a lot of data to show that, and the effect of just sitting under a sun lamp and how helpful that could be has been shown to be important. So in terms, and to answer, so that's a very long answer to your first question. Your second question, in terms of the effect of third shift and night shift work on the body, there's actually a colleague of mine who just emailed me this afternoon, come to think of it. She's done a lot of work looking at nurses and how shift work in nursing has really affected their health. And not only is there like mental health decline, but there's real issues in terms of figuring out, oh, do I just shift completely and not have any social life because everybody else is sleeping when I'm awake? Or do I kind of toggle back and forth? And there's been a lot of data to show that there's issues with metabolic disorders, mental health, heart health, and anything that's bad for the heart is pretty bad for the brain because the brain is so vascularized. So my best advice is like, do whatever you can to keep your heart healthy, and that should help with your brain being healthy. And I say that after I ate a cheesesteak for dinner. So, yes. Thank you. Yeah.
That's good. I have one online here. This is from Esther.
Okay.
Okay.
Hey, Esther.
Hey, Esther. She actually was asking about Alzheimer's. I think maybe this may be a stream in that, but she was saying, does long-standing sleep hygiene lead to, long-standing poor sleep hygiene lead to that higher rate of Alzheimer's disease?
Right. So do you increase the risk of Alzheimer's disease if you have poor sleep hygiene?
Right.
I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if the field knows the answer to that question. I can probably ask some of my expert Alzheimer's friends about that. I do think that is actually a big area of research. It's like, is poor sleep hygiene or continuous sleep deprivation leading to an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease? I don't think we have the answer to that question, honestly. My instinct is to say yes, so get better sleep, but I don't have any scientific data to back that up personally right now. So, but yeah, thanks for the question, Esther.
How would you define sleep deprivation?
How would I define sleep deprivation? That is an excellent question. Okay, so I scientifically, in my experiments, define sleep deprivation as a single bout of 5 hours of lost sleep in one night. Okay. I get asked all the time, what about chronic sleep deprivation? So we've actually been starting to work on these experiments where our mice are limited to only 4 hours of sleep every night for like weeks on end. We just started them. We're seeing similar issues, actually. I'm curious as to whether the body is able to recover as easily when it's chronic sleep deprivation. So scientifically, I define it as a single 5-hour bout lost of sleep. That is not necessarily, I don't think there is a universally defined, like, yes, you are sleep deprived or you're not sleep deprived based on the number of hours you sleep. And I think part of that is because the number of hours needed for sleep is so different for each individual. So there's generally data to show that women need more sleep than men. Not only do women need more sleep than men, but their sleep is less efficient than men. So there's some data to show that an individual's preference of need for sleep changes with age, as I showed you. So it's really hard to define what are you sleep deprived just by asking, you know. And actually there's a big push in the sleep research field to look for what we call biomarkers. So can you do like a finger prick test and know that somebody is sleep deprived based on that? You know, I think actually that is one thing we'd love to do. Can you do a breathalyzer and figure out that that person is sleep deprived? Because we've actually shown that you could actually be more impaired from sleep deprivation as a driver than alcohol, than being, you know, and so it's actually very, very dangerous, obviously, with the 100,000 car crashes and things. So we would love to try to get to that point of like, can we figure out some objective measure that doesn't require some kind of a battery of surveys along with a brain scan, but something where you can just breathe into a machine and it's like, yep, you are sleep deprived, you should not be driving, and we are not there yet. But that's one area that I know that the sleep research field wants to get to, because I think that would be really cool, like a finger prick or a breathalyzer, and it's like, no, you're really sleep deprived, please go to sleep, you know? So, yes.
How does someone with narcolepsy differ from somebody who is a healthy sleeper?
Yeah, so how does someone with narcolepsy differ from a healthy sleeper? So one thing I didn't mention, and I meant to mention this, is there are a lot of different reasons why people can't sleep. So it can be physiological, like you have the genes or are missing the genes as related to sleep issues. It can be like environmental, right? Bad sleep hygiene, or just other environmental things that you can't control, like that jackhammer in the middle of the night that you can't control or something like that. It could be psychological, you know, and we've all had the nights where we can't stop our brains from thinking, I'm sure, and then you stay up all night because you're like sitting there thinking about it. And so there's all sorts of reasons. Those with physiological reasons, there are drugs to help with help patients with narcolepsy to appropriately sleep or not sleep as needed. But you know, I actually am thinking of a student that I know right now that, you know, she clearly can sleep at the drop of a hat, but she also wakes up at the drop of a hat. And it's amazing because she's clearly sleeping in the middle of my lecture, but she's able to answer my questions. So I'm like, that's fine. Great, you have a gift. And so their metrics for sleeping would be a little bit different in terms of, that being said, you know, so much of the sleep field really started in the psychology field. Our sleep research founding fathers are the psychologists that like described it in their patients, the problems with sleep and things like that. The biology has really only really ramped up in, I would say, the last 20 to 25 years. So it's still fairly young in terms of the sleep biology research and really trying to be able to fully understand the impact of sleep and sleep deprivation in that. So I don't have a great answer for you, but that's the answer I can give right now.
We had another one from online. Would you recommend, oh, now this is speaking my language here. Would you recommend naps during the day? How long is enough?
All right, so the nap research is really fascinating. Remember those 90-minute cycles that I spoke of? You don't want to go into deep stage 3 or 4 in a nap.
Right.
Because it will ruin your sleep later that night. So the current data that some of my colleagues who actually do nap research are proposing is that essentially the sweet time is a 20-minute nap. So a 20-minute to 30-minute nap is considered the sweet spot because you're not going to go into stage 3 or 4, so you won't have that deep sleep inertia when you wake up. It is just long enough to get some stage 2 potentially, and hopefully it'll be just restored enough to reset to be able to continue with your day, because anything longer than 20 to 30 minutes, you are going to ruin the sleep for the next night, and then it's just going to be a vicious cycle. And so ideally, so for example, when we travel, we try to stay up as long as possible so that we can get into our appropriate day-night. And I have a very strong circadian clock. I cannot seem to shift as easily as my husband, who shifts very, very quickly. So I'm very jealous of that because my circadian clock is very strong and it doesn't want to shift no matter how tired I am. So in terms of naps, 20, 30 minutes is the currently suggested sweet window, but not much longer than that.
Anecdotally, I mean, I'm known for my 15-minute naps in the afternoon. What is fascinating to me is that I feel like maybe I'm not sleeping at all, but when that alarm goes off in 15 minutes, you would think I'd be wanting to stick around and say, I'm ready to roll.
Oh, really?
So the power nap works for me. I must not be going into 3.
Oh, you're probably not going into 3 or 4. If you would, you would feel that like grogginess and things of that
So
nature.
yeah, that's my testimony in that.
Yes.
But yes, here we go.
So I have a bunch of questions. They'd all be diagnostic, though, if you can help me.
Well, let's talk later then in terms of those.
Remember, she's a sleep doctor and a counselor.
Sleeper, yeah. I'll wake up at 1:10, 3 nights in a row. Yeah, I find going to sleep and staying asleep very difficult.
Yeah,
And so 3 or 4 nights a week, I have to take something to go to sleep, Benadryl or something.
right.
So I actually have a night's sleep. Last night I slept 4 hours, maybe 4, maybe 5.
Yeah.
On
Yeah.
the other hand, I can do, my wife she hates this. I do power naps. I will literally lay down on the couch or on the floor and fall asleep. And 3 minutes later wake up and I will feel
So much
totally
better.
refreshed.
Yeah.
I finish my day.
Yeah.
So you're saying,
I don't know how to figure out, why I've tried not drinking coffee.
Mhm.
I've tried not drinking alcohol.
Mhm. Mhm.
I don't do screen stuff. Yeah, so
Yeah.
you're saying you fall asleep and then wake up soon after that?
Oh, if I take naps during the day, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
Take a power nap.
Yeah, so I mean, I wish I had a great answer for the problem of staying asleep. So there's different ways that we could describe sleep issues, but certainly one big category of sleep problems would be this it would be either inability or difficulty initiating sleep, but there's also inability or difficulty to maintain sleep. And so it almost sounds like you're basically going through maybe 2 cycles, about 3 hours, maybe a little more, a little less, so 2 to 3 cycles, and then you're done. And I wish I had a great answer for you, because then I would have a great answer for some of my family members who really struggled with this. And I part of me wonders if there is some genetic component to it, and of this inability to maintain sleep. And so I know that there are sleep physicians that kind of specialize in this, and they do cognitive behavioral therapies. A friend of mine is actually a cognitive behavioral therapist that really focuses on this area of trauma-related sleep problems and things of that nature. So that's something that like a sleep doctor would certainly need to help you with. But it is not an uncommon problem. It is something that I think is much more common than is generally thought of. So, yeah, thank you.
I had a quick one. You had mentioned it's exciting to think about sleep number 2.
Stage 2.
Stage 2. Your mind processing. The scary part of that, right, would be the trauma could take place in that time, right?
Yep.
Is there any psychological work being done in that area?
Oh yeah, so I mean the impact of trauma as it relates to sleep and as it relates to memory is probably like one of the more bigger areas of research. And yeah, there's a lot of work being done in that in terms of how does trauma affect sleep in terms of initiating and maintaining sleep, because we haven't talked at all about dreams, and I know there's probably a lot of questions related to dreams, but that's all related to it in terms of the pathology. So yeah, there's a lot of work going on right now as to how it affects it, because it seems like whenever I do one of these talks, people always ask me about dreams, and I'm like, I don't do any dream research myself. I can tell you what I think about dreams if you're interested. But so in terms of dreams, so I think about it in a very biological context. So sleeping is essentially during sleep, things are happening in the brain to help reorder our thoughts and memories, okay? And re-engage the neurons that have been engaged before. And so there's a lot of data to show that in the absence of sensory information, so you're not seeing anything, right? You're not hearing anything per se. You're not really smelling anything. You're not really touching it. You're not engaging with the environment. So dreams is essentially what's happening in the brain in the absence of sensory information coming in. And what pathways and connections are being re-engaged during your sleep and solidifying those connections. Ironically, yesterday I was having a conversation with my father-in-law we were talking about how I'm a person that believes in God, and I believe that He is a personal God that wants to have an interaction with me through Jesus Christ. So I believe in a personal God. Therefore, how can I think that dreams are just my own thoughts in my own head that's kind of running around and bouncing between the different brain cells? I can't think about it that way if I believe in a personal God that brings people to mind. And actually, I've been doing this now for the last few months, where if they come to mind, I'll shoot them a text and be like, hey, you showed up in my dreams. And they're like, that sounds really weird. And then I say, take it as what it is.
Take it or leave it.
So, and happy to continue that conversation. But
Transcendence and as possible, Okay, if God's personal.
yeah.
There was a hand over here, was it Dan? Did you have your hand up before?
Oh, are you aware of any impacts of consuming food and then consuming alcohol shortly before sleep?
Oh, yeah. So, 100 years ago, people would take nightcaps, right, to help initiate sleep. We now know that's a terrible idea. Only because, so what alcohol does is, yes, it helps with the initiation of sleep, but it's actually terrible for the maintenance of sleep, and it actually destroys that 90-minute cycle, or it interferes with that 90-minute cycle that I was talking about, and actually the sleep is less efficient. So it might help you fall asleep, but it doesn't help you get good quality sleep, and so that's the problem with alcohol. I know a little bit less about the impact of food and sleep, other than I can tell you that sleep deprivation actually affects our food choices. And so those who are sleep deprived, who are working third shift, they have a tendency to eat fatty foods, and it changes our metabolic profile. So the question is, are they eating fatty foods simply because it's available and easy, chips and things like that? Or are they eating fatty foods because there is some kind of metabolic need that they're trying to meet? And that is a question I don't know if it's really been answered yet. But so I know a little bit about how sleep deprivation affects food choices, less so about how sleep and food are related in the same way that alcohol and sleep are related. So thank you for your question.
Before we get this fellow in the nice plaid shirt here, we had another one come in from the YouTubes. And yeah, in terms of the cycles and stuff, how is it that we dream? When does that happen? So
Okay.
specifically, when does it happen?
Yeah, so, years ago, sleep was thought, or dreams were thought to only occur during REM sleep. And that's been shown to be not necessarily true. So we have woken people up in stage 2, stage 3 and 4, and they have reported dreams in that. And the technology is such now that we are able to measure their brain waves using EEG, put that through a computer, and that computer will go through some algorithm and project the picture of what they were dreaming.
What?
Yeah, so the technology is there now. Yes.
Cut the cameras. Cut the cameras. This is weird. The world just changed. Cut the camera.
So the technology is starting to get there. So for example, the way it works is like, you're all hooked up to the computer. We'll tell the person, oh, think about a bird flying, and then it will kind of measure the bird flying, and then think about this and think about that, and then, all of these things. And then when they're dreaming, if they're dreaming about a seagull at a beach or something, and then they'll wake up and it's like, oh yeah, I was at a beach and there was a seagull, and you go back to the video and you could kind of see some weird outline of a seagull within the static noise of the thing. So there is some technology that's really starting like that. It's not quite Star Trek level yet, but it is pretty cool that we are starting to get there a little bit. So
That's so cool. That's cool, I think.
So was that the
Yep.
fullness of that answer? So dreams.
When the dreams take place,
So dreams do take place in, we have some data to show that dreams take place in multiple stages, not just REM sleep. Although the reason I think people think that dreams took place in REM sleep is because REM sleep happens when you wake up, right? So it's like it's closest to when you wake up. And so when you remember your dream, you were probably in REM sleep when that happened. And so, you know.
Right.
And also we call REM sleep paradoxical sleep because if you look at their brain waves, you actually can't tell the difference between someone who's awake and someone who's in REM sleep. It looks exactly the same. The only difference is that in REM sleep, you're completely paralyzed and you have no muscle tone. And so it's not the EEG that is telling us that someone's in REM sleep, it's their EMG. We have to actually measure the muscle tone. And when there's no muscle tone, we know that it's REM sleep. And if there is muscle tone, then you're awake. Or
Is it still rapid eye movement?
it's
though?
still rapid eye
So
movement,
that's
yeah.
still
Yeah, you will see the
occurs.
rapid eye movement as well,
Okay,
yes.
But there's that other physiological
But the
stuff.
brain waves, it's,
Huh.
yeah.
Wow, exactly the same. Yeah, here.
When I was a younger man, I realized that if I could have a vivid memory of the dream when I woke up in the morning, and by afternoon, I could not recall any of it. So I actually would take some notes, and that would, I could bring it back
Right,
if
yeah.
I had taken a note. My main question that I went into that from our discussion, I had a professor back in the 1980s. He was elderly. I was young. He had a kind of a non-scientific idea of sleep. He said every hour you got before midnight was worth 2. And just in terms of the physiology of it. So for him, he was one of those short sleepers too. I mean, didn't require a whole lot through the night. And then got up and did a lot of his good work when most other people were asleep.
We're asleep, yeah. So the idea that sleep before midnight is more valuable than sleep after midnight, yeah, I have never heard that before.
Okay.
And like in terms of a scientific idea, if I were spitballing here, just thinking about it, I can see how that might be relevant in the sense that if when you go to sleep, like at 9 o'clock, you're actually matching with your circadian cycle and the melatonin levels, and it's actually kind of like the optimal time to fall asleep. The optimal time to fall asleep is not 11 p.m. It's closer to 9 p.m. than it is to 11 p.m. And so so that anecdote of, every hour before midnight is worth 2, I can imagine that being meaningful biologically in that sense, but I've actually never heard that within the sleep field. But that might just be my naivete in the sleep field.
And
Yes.
then just the real quick one, in terms of good sleep hygiene, how long should it take to drop off?
How long should it take to fall asleep? This is a great question. So my professor at Brown, she actually helped, she's like one of the real big founders of sleep. I spent the summer at Brown, so that's why, that's kind of where a lot of my sleep knowledge comes from. And she's one of the big, she's one of the really big players in sleep research. Her name's Mary Carskadden, and Mary used to say that, she developed this test to measure sleepiness, and it's called the multiple sleep latency test. It measures, over multiple periods, it measures how long it takes you to fall asleep. If it takes you less than 10 minutes to fall asleep, that's a suggestion that actually you are sleep deprived. Okay. Now, I know some champion sleepers who fall asleep within 5 minutes, and they're not really sleep deprived. They're just champion sleepers, If it's taking you longer than 20 minutes to fall asleep, we actually say get out of bed and don't try to sleep. We want the bed to be associated with sleeping, I was just talking to a student who associates with bed with almost nothing else, nothing related to sleep, but almost everything else, because she does everything in bed,
Right, yeah.
working and looking and, and things like that. So part of good sleep hygiene is keeping to bed as sleep and, and things of that nature. But so if it's taking you longer than 20 minutes to fall asleep, that suggests that maybe there might be some insomnia issues or dysomnia issues in terms of initiating sleep, but probably not. There's actually a technique that Dr. Carskadden proposes where one thing you should do is if you find yourself having trouble falling asleep, and you know that your body's tired and you're just trying to fall asleep. You could have a clock, with the red numbers, like a digital clock, not your phone, but like a real clock, and have that on your nightstand and look at it, get into a comfortable position and look at it. Do not move. Okay, movement is the enemy of falling asleep. So even if you want to move thinking, oh, I just need a better position, just don't move. And if you stare at that clock with a relaxed pose, I guess, and looking at that clock, typically you will fall asleep by the end of that 20 minutes if you don't move. It's the movement part that's the issue. Almost always people end up moving thinking that's going to help them fall asleep, and it actually wakes them up. So that's something from a real sleep doctor. Yeah.
Another question related to waking up in the middle of the night.
Mm-hmm.
So what's good hygiene? You wake up at 2 in the morning. Do you read there, trying to sleep, you fall asleep, but you get up and do your finances and whatever else until you're tired? Yeah, but different advice on
Good
that.
question.
Yeah, so what is considered good sleep hygiene if you wake up in the middle of the night? So there's a couple of ways to think about this. One is if you are woken up, like are kind of groggy and you know you could possibly fall asleep again, then certainly, move that one time and then get comfortable and then let sleep come in 20 minutes. But if you find that after 20 minutes that sleep's not coming, and you know that you have this kind of habitual problem, the recommendation from my sleep colleagues would probably be get out of bed so that you're not spending hours tossing and turning in bed, because then you're starting to associate the bed with difficulty sleeping, not ease of sleeping. Mm-hmm. And the recommendation is not to look at your phone, not to watch television, but something that would be relaxing to you. So like whether it's like reading a book or praying or meditating or I wouldn't be cooking, I wouldn't be eating. I don't know, people do interesting things. So I wouldn't go swimming or anything like really dynamic.
Right.
Exercise is probably the enemy of that.
Yeah.
People think that exercise, it'll help me fall asleep, but actually what you're doing is in the process of exercising, you're waking yourself up.
Yeah.
So exercise is probably not good. Taking a warm bath, anything other than tossing and turning in the bed for hours. So getting out of bed is probably better. And then sitting down and then maybe reading and then going back to bed when you feel like you think you're going to fall back asleep is ideal. And there are some people that are just kind of perpetual, not nappers, that's not the word I'm looking for, but they don't seem to have these like consolidated periods of sleep. And I think it could potentially be genetically related, but I don't really have a lot of evidence for that other than my experience of one, which is not real scientific. So I'm not going to perpetuate that.
Okay, so on the flip side, go back to napping and all that, and other than depression or like long shift work, like cops who work 3 long shifts and then crash for days, is there harm in oversleeping?
Is there harm? Yeah, is there harm in oversleeping? I have not seen a lot of data to say that lots of sleep is bad. Other than it could potentially mess with your typical sleep cycle. So there was a fairly popular idea in sleep science not too long ago, basically that suggested that being slightly sleep deprived is actually good for you because it helps with the initiation of sleep for the next night. So instead of sleeping let's say, there's a joke that I heard where it's like, everyone needs 8.4 exactly hours of sleep. And so when people ask me what's the ideal hours of sleep, I say 8.4, and it's more of a joke statement, but really like we should be getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep as adults. And so if 8.4 is the ideal number, then maybe we should be getting 7.9 hours of sleep. Because being slightly sleep deprived can really help us initiate sleep the next night without causing debilitating problems with attention, memory, and cognition. So that's one thought about it. So that was a pretty popular idea. I don't know if that's really still popular in sleep science. But that was one idea. So I haven't seen any data to suggest that too much sleep is
So those
bad for.
teenagers who sleep those long stretches and all that.
They need more
Could be they
sleep than
need
they
it, yeah.
think.
Yeah.
Yes,
So-
yeah. So teenagers should be sleeping probably closer to 10 hours a night. And they are probably sleeping closer to 6 hours a night. And I was actually very guilty of this. So like I would sleep 4 hours a night when I was in high school, and then on the weekends sleep like 20.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was really healthy. It wasn't healthy. No, I know it wasn't healthy. And maybe some friends would say that I did that in graduate school as well. I don't know, but the idea is that sleep, people need more sleep than I think they realize. And so if you can get more sleep, that is generally suggested and appreciated.
I want to pick up on what you said about believing in a personal God. So, being a Christian, do you read the Bible differently than most people? Like when you pick up on things regarding sleep, either theologically or as an image or mentions of sleep or visions, like you must see things that maybe some of us don't see.
I
Or is there
do.
anything
Do I think about it differently? Do I read the Bible differently? Probably not. And the reason I say that is because my personhood is rooted in believing that the Bible is true. And so my lens that I see the world is from that perspective, believing that the Bible is true. My work as a scientist is still rooted in the belief that the Bible is true. That's my overarching belief. And so I believe I read the Bible similarly to those that also believe with me that the Bible is true, with that fundamental belief. If you do not believe that the Bible is true, then clearly we're working from a different metric, but that does not necessarily affect my science, because my science is rooted in what I have data for. So you'll hear me say like, I am just guessing here versus the data shows, because the language is slightly different. In terms of, when we hear about, when I'm reading about, Daniel's visions and things of that nature, to be honest, I haven't really thought about it in the sense that I think of it differently, because I am one that believes that God created science to show and basically expose his glory. And so when I see this cell that works perfectly under the microscope, I sit there and I'm like, wow, that's amazing that God could create that. Now, he created the first one, and then everything else is a replicate of that first one. That is the scientific idea of that cells don't come from nothing. It has to come from a predecessor cell. So so I think about it in those terms. I wouldn't say that I think about visions differently and things, because I actually think that God speaks to me in my dreams, and he brings people to mind in my dreams, and therefore I should reach out to them. And if I don't, then I'm being negligent in how God is nudging me. But I don't think about it as like, oh, God is somehow like, that does not discount how I think about the way my brain is working. The brain is still working the way it's supposed to be working. God has designed it to work it that way.
I think I want to fine tune a little bit. So like, what about ancient wisdom from the Bible or otherwise about sleep? Like, it mentions sleep. It's almost like a tautology. It doesn't have to be even, we don't have to discuss it. Of course we'll sleep. It's like, it's there. But I wonder, are there any ancient paths or wisdom about sleep that you'd say, oh, my science sort of backs this up about sleep? Is there anything like that?
So in terms of my science backs up these things about sleep and things of the Bible talking about sleep.
And I'm not fishing for something. I'm just like curious.
No, I know. I mean, nothing comes immediately to mind in terms of how my research on memories and sleep is either validated or not validated by the Bible. I haven't actually run into that myself.
Cool.
Yeah, so I don't have a great answer to that, other than science is cool and I think God uses it. So that's my best answer I got.
No, that's a great answer. Science is cool.
Science is cool and God's
We say-
created that too.
You're saying,
You've been
here,
doing
here.
that dream machine.
Cool, yeah, yeah.
Is there a way to get her article that you mentioned, if we don't subscribe?
I don't have any in print right now, but I might be able to get a
Oh, okay.
PDF to you.
That would be
So
great.
maybe hook up with me like online.
All right.
Remind me, I think I have a
Maybe
PDF
the whole
somewhere.
general population might
Good
want
question.
to.
I looked for one before I left. I have one hard copy left of that journal, so I can send PDFs if people want
Okay,
it.
that'd be
Yeah,
great.
good call. Do we have one more question?
Oh,
I thought I saw a hand here.
Yeah, it's kind of bouncing off what Tom just asked you, and you hinted at it before, the conversation about the need for sleep from an evolutionary standpoint versus the conversation within a faith-based community.
Mhm.
I know that probably pretty deep, but you mentioned that maybe bringing it up later. So I would just be curious to hear what is evolutionary model behind it, and then how does a person of faith interact with that, and what's kind of the tension within scientific community between evolutionary and then a theistic view of creation?
Right. Okay. So one of the kind of popular hypotheses that have popped up in the last 5 to 10 years, I would say, probably 5 years, more than 10 years, is this idea that early humans actually did not sleep one period, one night. Like they actually had 2 periods of sleep and there was a period of wakefulness in between. And I don't know what they would do in that time, but the idea is like when the early humans moved from out in the world and they moved into the caves and they discovered fire and all that stuff, that actually created fire is like the first electricity, so it created the opportunity to be productive in the middle of the night, and also this idea that the fire has to be fed, right? So like you couldn't just sleep through the night. So there's some ideas related to that. I'm honestly not very familiar with it because my interaction with evolutionary biology is like, well, we don't really know. So I'm not going to worry too much about what is related to that. I'm going to focus more on what I can personally measure and see. That being said, I do believe that evolution actually happened. That is my personal belief, and it does not interfere at all with my faith perspective. And so in terms of, I find that the most difficult tension in terms of the faith-based community and the idea of evolution is, and I think this is an unhelpful conversation, which is, I'll say what the unhelpful conversation is, I'll go into the helpful one. So I think it's unhelpful for me to, as a scientist, try to defend evolution to those who are faith-based, who do not believe in evolution, as a way for me to support my science. I feel that almost doesn't, I'm not speaking the language of a person from faith perspective to then try to convince them that my science is real. Like, that's not helpful, right? So as a scientist, I think the more helpful conversation with my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ is actually to talk about the idea that I believe the Bible's true. My work in science does not undercut my faith that the Bible is true. That's a much better starting point, because then we could have a real conversation that's actually has some give and take. So, and so I very rarely, or actually I never really talk about evolution as a way of supporting or defending my science, because especially to a faith community, because I don't know, I was not there when everything began, so I don't know. But there is a lot of scientific evidence that suggests that evolution is a real thing. And actually, I mean, we are seeing evolution happening like right now, in this moment, when we're talking about all the different variants of COVID. Like it is happening. We don't call it that very often, but that's what it is. And so there are modern day, real-time examples of organisms changing in response to the environment. But it's not that organisms are changing. So this is something I say to my biology students all the time. Evolution is not the idea that I change to the environment. That's adaptation in the world of neurobiology, okay? Evolution is the idea that populations, groups of things are changing, okay? The problem with the idea of the virus changing as an example of evolution is viruses are not alive. Viruses are not living things, so it's harder to ascribe evolution to that, but it's my best example of saying this is real-time change that's happening, of something changing. And so the idea that organisms do not change or populations of organisms do not change is a little bit silly because we've seen it, we've seen it in many, many populations. And so the definition of evolution has become really like a difficult conversation point for non-scientists because honestly, I don't think we do a great job of like trying to explain it to our students. And so there's these misconceptions going around. And then, we could talk about micro versus macro evolution and like first humans and stuff. And I am not an evolutionary biologist, so I'm not the most well-versed in that as a biologist. But like I said, I don't use the evolutionary biology perspective of sleep as a way to explain sleep to my brothers and sisters in the faith-based community because it's not helpful. I would rather us talk about things that are shared, and actually that's another big thesis of my thought patterns is we should spend much more time talking about the things that are shared between us as opposed to what differentiates us. Yes, it's beautiful that we're so unique and different, great, but I think it is more helpful for us to think of each other as what we are shared, because I've spent almost in my entire life, I've been different than my community. I've been, I was born with spina bifida. I've been in a wheelchair. I'm Asian. Like whatever it is, like I've spent a lifetime being different, and I'm sick of being different. I want us to recognize, yes, we're both human beings. That's a great start. Right. And I think that's where conversation could be much more helpful, because if we honor each other as reflections of God, I think that is far more useful. So I actually have much more useful conversations with even people of faith, of differing faith, in the sense that because they believe that they are a reflection of a higher power, and I'm like, great, me too. Let's start there. Those are where the conversations are easier. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I answered a question.
I think she should have the last word on that one. Yeah. Finding common ground, building bridges, finding that, shared humanity.
Yeah.
Not only for faith community, but also working in science. So that was terrific. I'm going to shut it down so that some of you guys can meet her before it gets too late, and so we can just thank her properly too. So
thank you.
Thank you. Very great. So.
And
Yeah.
I'm just curious, where did you come from? I don't know St. Joseph's University.
Oh.
How far did you travel to get here?
Oh, so we live in the Valley Forge area, so right by the park, and so it's about 20-30 minutes north of Philly.
Okay.
Yeah, so St. Joe's is right on straddles the Philly to the suburbs line, so it literally, the campus is on both. So.
You have a few minutes to
Yeah,
talk
I'll
to
hang
people?
out.
So, yeah.
Yep, so
All right, guys,
thank you.
Thank you for coming.